Sailors often say the sea has no memory. It swallows ships, it swallows storms, and by morning the water returns to glass, indifferent to what lies beneath. But there is one specific coordinate in the freezing darkness of the Baltic Sea that refuses to be forgotten. It is a place where a floating city, a palace of light and music, vanished in less than 60 minutes, taking 852 souls with it. She was the White Ship, a symbol of a new, free Europe gleaming against the pier. Inside there was dancing, there was luxury, and there was the absolute certainty of a safe arrival. But beneath the champagne glasses and the polished floors, a fatal calculation was already ticking. A secret conversation between a flawed lock and a violent ocean was about to turn a routine crossing into the deadliest maritime peacetime disaster of the 20th century. How does a vessel designed to be unsinkable disappear so fast that the distress calls are never finished? Was it truly just a storm, or was it a collision, a cover-up, or a design flaw that was known but ignored? Tonight, we are not just recounting a tragedy. We are descending 80 meters into the dark to piece together the broken timeline of the MS Estonia. So turn off the lights, settle deep into your chair, and let's listen to what the silence has to say. This is the story of the night the Baltic demanded its tithe. The sea, in its vast and indifferent patience, has always demanded a tithe from those who wish to cross it. For centuries, we paid this price in wood and sail, in the terrifying uncertainty of the wind. But as the 20th century hardened into steel and hummed with the confidence of diesel engines, we began to believe we had negotiated a new treaty with the ocean. We believed that if we built our machines large enough, fast enough, and clever enough, the sea would lose its power to surprise us. We believed that a schedule printed on a brochure could tame the Atlantic, and that a ticket purchased at a terminal was a guarantee of arrival. On the evening of September 27, 1994, the Baltic Sea was preparing to dismantle that belief. It was a Tuesday, a day of low grey skies and a biting wind that smelled of coming winter. In the harbour of Tallinn, the capital of a newly independent Estonia, a white giant sat against the pier. She was the MS Estonia. To the eye, she was magnificent, a floating city of 9 decks stretching over 500 feet long, her white paint gleaming even under the dull harbour lights. She was more than just a ferry. She was a symbol, a bridge between the bruised, recovering east and the glittering, prosperous west. Passengers walked up the gangways, clutching duty-free bags and overnight cases, stepping out of the cold Estonian air and into the warm, golden humidity of the ship's interior. The air inside smelled of coffee, heated carpet, and the distinct oily perfume of heavy machinery. There was music playing in the corridors. There was the clinking of glass in the bars. It was the sound of civilization, a sound that wraps you in a blanket of safety. When you are inside a vessel of this magnitude, surrounded by restaurants and saunas and video arcades, it is almost impossible to remember that you are effectively standing on a steel bubble, suspended over a dark, freezing abyss. The routine is the most dangerous anesthesia. Most of the nearly 1,000 souls on board had made this crossing before, or crossings like it. The ritual was familiar. You drive your car onto the cavernous deck, you find your cabin, you head to the buffet, you drink a beer, you go to sleep, you wake up in Stockholm. The process feels as reliable as a train, as inevitable as the sunrise. But the sea does not care about routines. The sea does not care about the political optimism of a new Europe. On this night, the Baltic was waking up. A low-pressure system was churning its way toward the shipping lanes, whipping the water into a frenzy that would soon test the arrogance of naval architecture. To understand why this specific night became a graveyard, we must look away from the passengers settling into their bunks and look instead at the machine itself. We must look at the blueprint of the disaster. The Estonia was a roll-on, roll-off ferry, a ro-ro. This design is the lifeblood of modern maritime commerce. It is efficient, it is profitable, it turns a ship into a continuation of the highway. Cars and trucks drive in at one end and drive out at the other. It eliminates the slow crane-operated loading of the past. But to achieve this efficiency, engineers had to make a bargain with physics. A traditional ship is divided into small, watertight compartments. If the hull is breached, water fills only one small room and the ship remains afloat. A ro-ro ferry is different. Its heart is the car deck, a massive open garage running the length of the vessel, situated just above the waterline. It is a vast, hollow cathedral of air. For the ship to generate profit, this deck must be full of vehicles. But for the ship to survive, this deck must remain perfectly dry. If water enters this space, this wide, unobstructed floor, it does not sit still. It sloshes. It rushes from side to side with the roll of the waves. This is known as the free surface effect. Imagine carrying a large, shallow tray of water while walking across a rocky field. If you stumble, the water rushes to one side, pulling the weight of the tray with it, throwing you further off balance. Now imagine that tray is 500 feet long, and the water is the heavy, cold Atlantic. If the sea finds a way onto the car deck, the ship is no longer a stable platform. It becomes a pendulum that wants to capsize. The only thing standing between that open car deck and the crushing force of the waves was the bow. The nose of the Estonia was not a solid wall of steel. It was a gate. To let the cars in, the entire nose of the ship, the bow visor, was designed to lift up on hydraulic hinges, like the helmet of a medieval knight opening his visor to speak. Behind this visor stood a second gate, a loading ramp that folded up to form a watertight bulkhead. This complex mechanism of steel arms, hydraulic pistons, and locking pins was a marvel of engineering. It allowed the ship to swallow semi-trucks in seconds, but it also meant that the ship was sailing into the teeth of the Baltic storms with its mouth technically closed, but held shut only by a few pieces of metal. On the bridge, the mood was professional, perhaps even a little complacent. The captain, Arvo Andresen, was a man of the sea, respected and experienced, but he was also a man under pressure. The Estonia was the pride of the line, and she was running on a tight schedule. Delays cost money. Delays damaged the reputation of the new shipping route. The timetable demanded speed, and speed in heavy weather is a violent act. When a ship drives hard into oncoming waves, it does not slice through them like a knife. It hammers against them. As the lines were cast off and the Estonia pushed away from the dock in Tallinn, the wind was already howling at roughly 20 knots. It was manageable. It was normal. The passengers watched the lights of the city fade into the black horizon, then turned their attention inward. The duty-free shops opened their shutters. The bands began to tune their instruments in the Baltic bar. The ship was a bubble of light moving through a universe of darkness. But deep in the structure of the vessel, the conversation between the steel and the sea had already begun. It was a conversation of stress and fatigue, spoken in the language of groans and vibrations that most passengers mistook for the normal operation of the engines. They did not know that the bow visor, that great knight's helmet, had a history. They did not know that the locking devices, the steel pins meant to hold the visor shut against the pounding of the waves, were not designed for the kind of punishment they were about to receive. The design of the visor had been conceived in a different era for calmer waters, mostly protected archipelagos. The calculations assumed that the waves would mostly hit the hull, not slam directly into the visor itself. But on the open Baltic, running at full speed into a headwind, the visor acts like a giant scoop. It takes the full force of every wave impact. Tons of water, moving at high velocity, colliding with the steel plate again and again. Consider the metallurgy of trust. When we step onto a plane or a ship, we trust that someone, somewhere, has done the math. We trust that the bolts are thick enough, that the welds are X-rayed, that the safety margins are generous. We do not imagine that the safety of a billion-dollar vessel might come down to the integrity of a few mild steel lugs, pieces of metal no bigger than a loaf of bread, corroding quietly in the salt spray. As the Estonia cleared the coast and entered the open sea, the weather deteriorated rapidly. The wind rose to force 8, then force 9 on the Beaufort scale, a gale. The waves grew to 4 meters, then 5, then 6. In the darkness, these waves were invisible until they crashed against the hull, exploding in white phosphorescence. The ship began to pitch. The bow would rise up, climbing the face of a wave, hanging for a moment in the void, and then crash down into the trough with a shudder that ran through the entire keel. Inside the cabins, duty-free bottles rattled on shelves, handbags slid across floors. For the passengers, this was uncomfortable, perhaps a little frightening, but it was still within the realm of the expected. It was a storm. Ships go through storms. They lay in their bunks, staring at the ceilings, waiting for sleep, waiting for Stockholm. They trusted the machine. They trusted the captain. They trusted that the ship was unsinkable because the idea of it sinking was too large, too catastrophic to entertain. But there is a specific physics to a disaster. It is rarely a single event. It is a chain, a sequence of dominoes arranged by negligence, bad luck, and time. The first domino had been placed years earlier, on the drafting tables where the visor was designed. The second was placed in the maintenance logs, where minor damage to the seals and locks had been noted, but perhaps underestimated. The third was the schedule, the demand for speed. And now, the fourth domino was the storm itself. By midnight, the Estonia was fighting. She was roughly halfway to Stockholm, alone in the churning black water. The impacts on the bow were becoming violent. Boom, 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 a rhythmic hammering. On the bridge, the crew could feel the deceleration with each hit, the ship shuddering as if it had struck a wall. But they could not see the bow. From the bridge windows, the forecastle deck obscures the view of the visor. They were blind to the trauma happening just a few meters beneath their feet. Sensors were supposed to tell them if the visor was secure, a panel of lights, green for locked, red for open. But sensors are simple creatures. They check if a bolt is in a hole. They do not check if the bolt is about to shear, or if the steel around the hole is tearing like wet paper. The lights on the bridge remained green. The machine was lying to its masters. Down on the car deck, the environment was hostile. The air was thick with diesel fumes. The suspension of the heavy trucks groaned as the ship heaved. The cars were lashed down, chains pulled tight, but the forces were immense. If you were standing there, in the cavernous dark of the vehicle deck, you would have heard the storm differently. You would have heard the metallic scream of the bow visor being pried loose. The visor was held by a bottom lock, 2 side locks, and 2 heavy hinges at the top. It was a fortress gate, but water is a battering ram that never tires. With every wave, hundreds of tons of force slammed upward against the bottom of the visor. The steel of the Atlantic lock, the primary locking device, began to yield. It wasn't a sudden snap, not yet. It was a deformation. The metal was stretching, warming up at the molecular level, crying out under the load. In the public spaces, the band had stopped playing. The bars were emptying as people sought the horizontal safety of their beds to escape seasickness. The karaoke machine was silent. The illusion of the floating hotel was beginning to crack. The sheer violence of the motion made it hard to walk. You had to hold onto the railings, timing your steps with the roll. The ship was no longer a static place. It was a living beast, thrashing in the dark. This is the moment where the tragedy shifts from a possibility to an inevitability. It is the moment when the system is pushed beyond its elastic limit. There is a point in engineering called the yield point. Below this point, metal bends and bounces back. It is resilient. Beyond this point, the deformation is permanent. The structure remembers the damage. The Estonia had passed the yield point. The locks were failing. Around 12:30 in the morning, a loud sound was heard. A metallic crash, like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil, echoing through the forward structure of the ship. A seaman was sent down to the car deck to investigate. He looked around. He saw the rows of trucks, the swaying cars. He heard the groaning of the steel, but he saw no water. He saw no breach. The visor, the source of the noise, was hidden behind the inner ramp. The damage was invisible from the inside. He reported that everything looked normal, the reassurance of normal. It is the most dangerous word in a crisis. It allows the mind to reset, to dismiss the fear. The captain, hearing the report, kept the throttles forward. The ship drove on, maintaining speed, driving the damaged visor into the waves with renewed force. It was a death sentence delivered by the desire for punctuality. If we could freeze time at this moment, just past midnight, the storm at its height, we would see a tableau of heartbreaking fragility. We would see parents tucking blankets around sleeping children in the lower decks below the waterline. We would see young lovers talking in the corridors. We would see the crew in the engine room, monitoring dials that showed perfect oil pressure and perfect temperature, unaware that the parameters that mattered were failing just a few hundred feet away. We would see a civilization entirely dependent on a thin shell of steel, and outside the Baltic Sea, cold, chaotic, and utterly without mercy, was probing for a weakness. It had found one. The visor began to move. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to start the final sequence. The bottom lock gave way completely. The heavy steel bolt sheared off, snapping with the sound of a gunshot that was swallowed by the roar of the wind. Now only the side locks and the upper hinges held the massive steel nose in place. The visor was loose. It began to bounce up and down, slamming against the hull. The noise must have been horrific. A grinding, screeching complaint of metal on metal. Passengers in the forward cabins heard it. Some woke up. They asked each other what it was. Ideally ice, someone might have said, though it was too early in the year for ice. Ideally the anchor, another might have guessed. The mind reaches for familiar explanations. It refuses to visualize the bow of the ship ripping itself apart. In the mythology of the sea, there are stories of ghost ships, of monsters, of sudden voids. But the monster here was physics. It was the leverage of the long visor acting against the hinges. As the visor worked itself loose, it began to pull on the inner ramp, the second gate. The ramp was connected to the visor mechanically. As the visor flopped open, it dragged the ramp down with it. Imagine the top of a convertible car being ripped off by the wind, but the convertible top is made of 50 tons of steel. The hinges screamed, the deck plating tore, and then the visor was gone. It fell forward, tumbling into the sea, vanishing into the white foam. But in its violent departure, it had pulled the loading ramp fully open. The mouth of the ship was now wide open. The Estonia was traveling at 14 knots. She was scooping up the Baltic Sea. The water did not trickle in. It did not leak. It surged. A wall of green, freezing water, meters high, crashed onto the car deck. This is the moment the stability calculations turn to dust. The car deck, that vast open cathedral, began to flood. Thousands of tons of water accumulated in seconds. The free surface effect took hold instantly. The water rushed to the starboard side. The ship listed. Not a gentle lean, but a sudden, sickening lurch to the right. In the cabins, people were thrown from their beds. In the bars, glasses slid off tables and shattered. The slot machines toppled over, spilling coins that slid across the carpet like hail. The illusion of safety vanished in a heartbeat. The world had tilted. On the bridge, the chaos was absolute. The horizon line, usually level, was suddenly diagonal. The inclinometer, the instrument that measures the tilt of the ship, swung wildly. 10 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees. Gravity, once a constant downward force, was now pulling everyone sideways. The floor was becoming a wall. The wall was becoming a ceiling. The crew tried to correct it. They tried to turn the ship to port, to use the wind to prop her up. But a ship with a flooded car deck is no longer a ship. It is a sinking stone. The engines were still running. The lights were still on. But the Estonia was already dead. She just hadn't gone under yet. The passengers, confused, groggy, terrified, began to scramble. But how do you escape a labyrinth when the world is tilted at 30 degrees? Staircases become cliffs. Corridors become slides. Doors become trapdoors. The geography of survival had changed. This was no longer a journey from Tallinn to Stockholm. It was a race against the angle of the deck, a race against the water rising from below, a race against the cold, and it all happened in the dark. The silence of the drafting room where the ship was designed feels very far away now. The quiet discussions about cost-cutting and efficiency are distant echoes. Here in the middle of the Baltic, there is only the roar of the water and the screaming of the wind. The grand ambition of the white ship, the symbol of freedom, was being dragged down by the weight of its own design flaws. The sea had entered the machine, and the machine was losing. As the list increased to 40 degrees, the engines began to fail due to lack of oil pressure. The hum of the ship, that constant reassuring vibration of power, sputtered and died. The lights flickered. The emergency generator kicked in, casting a sickly dim light over the tilting corridors. The Estonia drifted sideways, broadside to the waves, rolling helplessly. The window of opportunity for survival was closing. It was measured in minutes now. We are witnessing the end of an era of maritime innocence. The belief that technology had conquered the ocean was drowning in the cold water of the car deck. The routine was over. The nightmare had begun. To understand the scale of what happened next, we must slow down. We must stop thinking in terms of statistics, 852 dead, and start thinking in terms of seconds. The second the foot slips on the linoleum, the second the hand misses the railing, the second the lights go out for the last time. The ship is a dying animal, rolling in the surf, and inside her belly, hundreds of people are waking up to a world that no longer makes sense. Act 1 is the story of hubris. It is the story of building a palace on a foundation of sand. It is the story of believing that because a ship is big, it is safe. That because the sea looks beautiful in the brochure, it is kind. But the Baltic is not kind. It is indifferent. And on this night, it was hungry. The list is now 45 degrees. Walking is impossible. You have to crawl. You have to climb. The furniture is falling. The piano in the bar crashes through the wall. The grand ambition is sinking, and the long, cold night has only just begun. To understand the true anatomy of a disaster, we must retreat from the external view of the storm-battered hull and descend into the warm, illuminated belly of the machine. We must go back to the moments before the list became terminal, to the time when the Estonia was still a sanctuary, floating in the suspension of disbelief. Inside the vessel, the atmosphere was a peculiar mix of revelry and fatigue. It was late. The ship's clocks were ticking past midnight. In the Baltic bar on deck 6, the house band was playing the final set of the night. The mood was determinedly cheerful, a man-made resistance against the violence of the motion outside. The passengers here were the night owls, the celebrants, the ones for whom the journey was as important as the destination. They held their drinks with the practiced grip of seasoned travelers, bending their knees slightly as the floor rose and fell. But below them, in the cabins on decks 4 and 1, spaces that sat below the waterline, the experience was different. Here the storm was not a backdrop, it was an intruder. The sound of the water rushing past the steel plates was a constant high-pressure hiss. The slamming of the bow against the waves echoed through the structural beams like the tolling of a great muffled bell. Sleep was difficult. The body knows when it is being moved against its will. The inner ear registers the chaotic acceleration, the lurching drops that leave the stomach suspended for a fraction of a second. In these lower cabins, people lay in the dark, staring at the underside of the bunk above them. They listened, and they heard things that the music in the bar concealed. They heard the metallic groans of the car deck latches. They heard the shuddering complaints of a ship being twisted by forces it was struggling to absorb. There is a specific sound that survivors would later recall, a sound that cut through the ambient noise of the engines and the wind. It was described as a scrape, followed by a heavy thud, a sound like heavy furniture being dragged across a metal floor. It was the sound of the bow visor, that 55-ton steel helmet grinding against its own housing. The hinges were stretching, the locks were screaming, the visor was moving, hopping up and down on the snout of the ship, slowly chewing through the metal that held it in place. Crew members heard it too. A watchman, making his rounds, descended into the cavern of the car deck. This space, the garage of the ship, was a landscape of shadows and grease. Rows of trucks and trailers stood chained to the deck, swaying in unison like a herd of sleeping elephants. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and salt. The watchman heard a metallic bang, a sharp report that sounded like a sledgehammer striking the hull. He reported it. He checked the indicator lights. Green. Everything green. This is the tyranny of the sensor. A small bulb on a control panel has more authority than the human ear. The light said the visor was locked. The light said the ramp was sealed. The machine was insisting on its own health, even as it was beginning to die. The watchman returned to his rounds. The captain, high above on the bridge, maintained speed. The schedule was the god they served, and the sea was just an obstacle to be powered through. But the physics of the ocean are relentless. They do not care about sensors. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the final structural betrayal occurred. The visor, having broken its lower lock, swung upward in the violence of a massive wave. The hinges, designed to hold the weight only during loading in a calm harbor, were subjected to the full lifting force of the Atlantic. They snapped, The visor did not just fall off, it was pushed back, over the top of the bulbous bow, catching the loading ramp as it went. It peeled the ship open. If you were standing on the car deck at that precise second, the world ended. The ramp, which acted as the watertight door, was ripped open at the top. The sea, which had been hammering at the gates, accepted the invitation. It began not as a trickle but as a river. A torrent of freezing green water surged over the ramp and onto the car deck. The noise would have been deafening, a roar that drowned out the engines, the wind, and the thoughts in your own head. This is where the nightmare of the free surface effect moved from a textbook theory to a terrifying reality. The car deck was open, no bulkheads, no dividers, just a massive, flat expanse of steel. The water that entered did not sit still. It rushed to the starboard side as the ship rolled, hundreds of tons of water moving as a single cohesive mass. When a ship rolls, it is supposed to roll back. The buoyancy of the hull pushes it upright. It is a pendulum that seeks the center. But when you add loose water to the deck, the pendulum breaks. The water slides to the low side and stays there. It holds the ship down. It prevents the recovery. The Estonia rolled to starboard, a deep, heavy roll. The passengers in their beds felt gravity shift. They waited for the return roll. They waited for the bed to level out. It didn't. The ship hung there, listing, 5 degrees, then 10. In the public spaces, the change was subtle at first, then undeniable. In the pub Admiral, the glasses sliding across the tables didn't stop at the edge. They fell. The band stopped playing. The drummer's stool slid sideways. A nervous laughter rippled through the room, the sound of people trying to normalize the abnormal. "Whoa," someone might have said. "Hold on." But the list did not stabilize. The water on the car deck was accumulating. Every wave that hit the open bow sent more tons of the Baltic into the garage. The weight was increasing by the second. The center of gravity was shifting aggressively to the right. The list deepened to 15 degrees. This is the angle where standing becomes difficult. You have to widen your stance. You have to grab a railing. In the cabins, sleeping passengers rolled out of their bunks. Luggage slid from racks. The sensation was not of a ship rolling, but of the entire world tilting on its axis. Then came the panic. Not a scream, but a silence. A sudden collective realization that something was fundamentally wrong. The engines were still throbbing, vibrating through the floor, but the rhythm felt different now, labored, as if the ship itself was gasping for air. On the bridge, the routine collapsed into confusion. The horizon line in the windows was skewed. The inclinometer needle swung past the safe limits. The officers stared at the monitors. They saw the list, they felt it, but they could not see the bow. They still did not know that the front of their ship was missing. They thought perhaps a truck had shifted. They thought perhaps the stabilizers had failed. They were trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. They attempted to turn the ship. They swung the wheel to port, trying to use the centrifugal force to counteract the list. It was a standard maneuver, but in this condition it was fatal. By turning the broadside of the ship into the wind and waves, they exposed the open wound of the bow even more. The sea poured in faster. The list hit 20 degrees. Now, the geography of the ship began to turn hostile. We design our environments for a vertical world. Floors are flat, stairs are vertical, doorways are upright. When you tilt that world by 20 degrees, the architecture turns against you. A corridor is no longer a hallway, it is a valley. If you are on the high side, the port side, your cabin door is suddenly on the ceiling. You have to climb up to get out. If you are on the low side, the starboard side, your door is on the floor, and the weight of the furniture, the luggage, and your own body is pinning it shut. Inside the cabins, the confusion was absolute. People woke up in the dark, disoriented. They tried to stand, but the floor threw them against the wall. They tried to open their doors, but the frames were twisted by the torque of the hull. They were trapped in small steel boxes that were slowly rotating. Language became a barrier. The announcements, when they finally came, were brief, confused, and often in Estonian. "Haire, haire," the voice said. "Alarm, alarm." But for the Swedish passengers, for the elderly, for the children, the words were just noise. There was no clear instruction, no go to the lifeboats. Just a coded cry of distress from a bridge that was losing control. The list reached 30 degrees, At 30 degrees, friction loses its battle with gravity. You cannot walk on a linoleum floor tilted at 30 degrees. You slide. In the corridors, people who had managed to escape their cabins were sliding down the walls, crashing into those below them. Vending machines tore loose from their bolts and became missiles. The heavy steel fire doors, designed to close automatically, slammed shut with bone-crushing force, cutting off escape routes. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a funhouse of terror. Up was no longer up. The floor was now the wall. The wall was now the ceiling. Passengers had to scramble over handrails, stepping on the faces of slot machines, climbing doorframes like ladders. In the stairwells, the scene was biblical. A mass of humanity, half-dressed, clutching life jackets, trying to ascend. But the stairs were pitched at a terrifying angle. To climb the stairs meant pulling yourself up by the banister, hand over hand, while the ship bucked and heaved. Older people couldn't do it. They froze. They clung to the railings, blocking the way for those behind them. Panic is contagious, but so is paralysis. Many people simply sat down. They sat on the steps, on the floor, in the corners of the bars. They went into shock. The sheer scale of the catastrophe overwhelmed their processing power. They waited for instructions that would never come. They waited for the crew to fix it. They trusted the authority of the uniform, even as the uniform was sliding across the deck. The crew was fighting a battle they could not win. In the engine room, the engineers watched the oil pressure gauges drop. The engines rely on oil pickup tubes sitting in the sump. With the ship tilted so severely, the oil ran away from the tubes. The lubrication failed. One by one, the main engines seized and died. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. The deep rhythmic thrumming of the diesels, the heartbeat of the ship, stopped. The lights flickered, dimmed, and then went out. Total darkness. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of the wind screaming outside and the crashing of loose objects inside. Then the emergency lights kicked in. Dim, yellow, battery-powered beams that cast long, swinging shadows. They did not illuminate the ship. They merely revealed the contours of the trap. The list passed 40 degrees. At this angle, the windows on the promenade deck touched the water. These were large panoramic windows, designed to offer a view of the sunset. They were not designed to hold back the ocean. The pressure built. The glass groaned, bowed, and then shattered. Water burst into the upper decks. It wasn't just coming from the car deck anymore. It was entering the passenger spaces directly. The sanctuary was breached. The water was cold, 10 degrees Celsius. It swept through the bars and the shops, carrying away tables, chairs, duty-free liquor, and people. Those who were still inside the ship, still trying to climb the stairwells, now heard a new sound, the roar of water rising from below. It was chasing them. The staircases became chimneys for the rising sea. The air pressure increased as the water displaced the volume of the hull. Ears popped. The wind whistled through the elevator shafts. Survivors recount a strange phenomenon during these final minutes: the loss of social inhibition. Strangers grabbed each other. People screamed names of family members into the dark. But there was also a chilling politeness in some corners. People helping each other up the steep floors, forming human chains, handing children from person to person. A desperate, improvised cooperation in the face of annihilation. But for every act of heroism, there was an act of physics that rendered it futile. The list reached 50 degrees, then 60. You cannot stand at 60 degrees. You are walking on the walls. The corridors are vertical shafts. If you let go of a railing, you fall, not to the floor, but across the width of the ship, dropping 10 or 15 feet onto the doors of the cabins on the low side. Many died this way, broken by the fall before the water ever touched them. On the bridge, the captain and the crew were clinging to the consoles. They had finally sent the Mayday call. "Mayday, Mayday, Estonia, please." The voice on the radio was not professional. It was terrified. It was the voice of a man watching his death approach. They gave their coordinates. They asked for help. But the radio blackout was coming. The ship's main power was gone, and the emergency batteries were failing as the list became extreme. The silence on the radio channels was the sound of the Baltic claiming victory. By now, the ship was lying on its side. 90 degrees. The funnel, the great chimney of the ship, hit the water with a hiss of steam. The windows of the bridge smashed. The captain was washed away. The hierarchy of command was dissolved. There were no more orders. There was only the instinct to breathe. For those trapped inside, the world had turned completely perpendicular. They were standing on the walls of the stairwells, looking up at the doors that led to the open deck, which were now trapdoors in the ceiling above their heads. To escape, they had to climb straight up. Imagine the physical strength required to do a pull-up. Now imagine doing it while wearing a bulky life jacket, wet, freezing in the dark, while the structure around you shudders and groans. Now imagine doing it while holding a child. Most could not do it. They gathered on the landings, the water rising around their ankles, then their waists. They waited. They prayed. They screamed. And then the water took them. But some, the young, the strong, the lucky, managed to scramble out. They crawled through the doors onto the side of the hull. The hull of a capsized ship is a surreal landscape. It is a steel island, slippery with slime and paint, beaten by rain and waves. It is not flat, it is curved, slick, and terrifyingly exposed. The survivors emerged from the interior like ants crawling out of a broken log. They stood on the side of the ship, shivering in the gale. They looked around and saw the horror of their situation. The ship was not just listing, she was sinking by the stern. The back of the ship was going down first. The bow was rising into the air. They were standing on a dying whale. The wind tore at their clothes. The waves crashed over the hull, washing people back into the sea. There were life rafts, but they were designed to be launched from an upright ship. Now the canisters were trapped in their cradles or hanging uselessly in the air. People struggled to deploy them. Some rafts inflated upside down. Some blew away before anyone could board them. And in the water, the scene was a mosaic of tragedy. Hundreds of people were bobbing in the waves, supported by life jackets, but the life jackets could not protect them from the cold. The Baltic in September is a thief of heat. It steals the warmth from the blood in minutes. The survivors on the hull watched as the lights of the other ships appeared on the horizon. The Mariella, the Silja Europa. Great. Floating hotels, rushing toward them, but they were too far away. The Estonia groaned one last time, a deep, resonant boom from the depths of the hull as the trapped air compressed and bulkheads collapsed. The stern slipped under. The angle increased. The bow rose higher, pointing accusingly at the black sky. And then she began to slide back. The people on the hull scrambled higher, trying to stay on the steel island as it shrank. But the ocean was swallowing it. The bridge went under. The radar mast went under. In the final moments, the ship was vertical, a tombstone of white steel standing in the black waves. And then, with a rush of bubbles and debris, she was gone. The sea closed over the Estonia. Where there had been a ferry, a city, a civilization, there was now only churning water, wreckage, and the heads of the survivors bobbing in the dark. The silence returned. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a vacuum, the silence of absence. 852 people had just vanished from the surface of the earth. But for the survivors in the water, the ordeal was not over. It was shifting phases. They had survived the machine. Now they had to survive the element. The cold was sharp. It felt like burning. It tightened the muscles and slowed the heart. It clouded the mind. In the darkness, voices called out to each other. "Is anyone there? Help me. Don't let go." They formed clusters, holding on to overturned rafts, holding on to debris, holding on to each other. They became small, fragile archipelagos of life in a vast, freezing ocean. They watched the lights of the approaching rescue ships. They looked like stars fallen to the water, but the waves were huge, 6, 7 meters high. The rescue ships were giants, but in this weather, they were clumsy giants. They could not launch their lifeboats. The waves would smash them against the hulls. They could only stand by and use their searchlights, sweeping the water with beams of white light. The beams illuminated the horror, faces white with shock, hands gripping lifelines with the rigidity of death, empty life jackets floating like ghosts. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. The cold seeped into the marrow. This is the stage of the disaster known as the survival phase. But that term implies activity. For many, it was a passive waiting. waiting for the heart to stop, waiting for the light to find them. And all the while, 80 meters below their feet, the Estonia settled into the mud of the Baltic floor. She landed on her starboard side, the side with the open wound. The visor, the cause of it all, lay a mile away, a discarded piece of evidence in a crime scene that spanned the entire sea. The tragedy of the Estonia is not just that she sank, it is how fast she sank. Less than an hour from the first sign of trouble to the final disappearance. It was a catastrophe of speed. It gave no time for dignity, no time for goodbyes. It was a brutal, mechanical subtraction of life. As the dawn began to grey the eastern horizon, the wind finally began to drop. The fury of the storm spent itself. But it was too late. The light of the morning sun revealed the emptiness of the sea. The floating city was gone. And in its place, a new reality had been born, a reality of grief, of questions, and of a silence that would haunt the Baltic for generations. This was the end of the event, but it was only the beginning of the story. For the dead, the suffering was over. For the living, the survivors, the families, the engineers, the politicians, the long, painful listing of their own lives was just beginning. The sea had taken its tithe, and now the world would have to reckon with the cost. The Baltic Sea does not bargain. It operates on a set of physical laws that are ancient, absolute and indifferent to human suffering. When the MS Estonia vanished beneath the surface, the clock did not stop. For the 852 people who went down with the ship, time had ended. But for the 137 people floating in the wreckage, time had transformed into an agonizing, viscous substance. It was no longer measured in hours or minutes, but in heartbeats, in shivering breaths, and in the creeping numbness of the extremities. We must now descend into the water. We must understand the cold arithmetic of the Baltic. The temperature of the water was roughly 10 degrees Celsius. In the abstract, 10 degrees sounds manageable. It is the temperature of a cool spring day. But water conducts heat away from the human body 25 times faster than air. To be immersed in 10-degree water is to be enclosed in a suit of ice. It is a theft. The ocean steals your warmth calorie by calorie, starting with the skin, then the muscles, and finally the core. The survivors were not swimming. They were existing. They bobbed in the violent swell, encased in orange life jackets that held their heads above the foam but could do nothing to stop the freezing. The sea was covered in a slick, suffocating layer of heavy fuel oil that had bled from the ship's tanks. It coated their faces, blinded their eyes, and made every surface slippery. To climb into a life raft in these conditions required the strength of an athlete. But the people in the water were grandmothers, truck drivers, teenagers, and musicians. They were exhausted, shocked, and greased with oil. The life rafts themselves were a cruel disappointment. They were designed to deploy automatically, bursting from their canisters and inflating into protective tents. But the wind had flipped many of them upside down. They were dark, rubber caves filled with water, drifting aimlessly in the gale. Survivors who managed to claw their way onto these inverted rafts found themselves sitting on the curved, slippery bottoms, completely exposed to the wind. Those who managed to get inside the upright rafts found them flooded with freezing water, a chaotic tumble of bodies and vomit. In the darkness, the geography of survival was reduced to the immediate radius of one's own arm. You held onto a strap. You held onto a stranger. You held onto the belief that help was coming. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the silence began to reclaim the noise. The shouting faded. The screaming stopped. Not because the terror had passed, but because the cold acts as a sedative. It dulls the mind, it slows the speech, it convinces the brain that sleep is a good idea. To fall asleep in that water was to die. High above this scene of localized hell, the machinery of rescue was grinding into motion, but it was a machine paralyzed by the weather. The distress calls from the Estonia had been heard. The ferries, Mariella and Silja Europa, were the first to arrive. These were massive ships, towering white cliffs of steel that appeared out of the storm like leviathans. But they were impotent. The captains of these vessels looked down from their bridges, 10 stories above the water, and saw the tiny, flickering lights of the life jackets in the abyss below. They wanted to help. The maritime code demands it, but to lower a lifeboat into 6-meter waves is suicide. The boats would be smashed against the hull before they even touched the water. The ferries could do nothing but act as windbreaks. They positioned their massive hulls to block the gale, creating a slightly calmer patch of water in their lee, hoping to give the survivors a fighting chance. They turned their searchlights onto the dark water, sweeping the beams back and forth. The beams revealed a graveyard. They illuminated empty rafts, debris, and the pale faces of the dead. But they also illuminated the living, hands waving feebly, signal flares sputtering in the wind. The passengers on the high decks of the Mariella looked down in horror. They saw people dying just a few hundred meters away, separated by a vertical wall of steel and a raging sea. It was a torture of proximity, so close yet unreachable. The true heroes of the night did not come by sea, they came by air. The Finnish and Swedish rescue helicopters began to arrive. These were the angels of the machine age, Super Pumas and Sea Kings, thundering in low over the waves, their rotors fighting the turbulence. But even for them, the task was nearly impossible. The pilots had to hover in hurricane-force gusts, holding a steady position over a drifting raft, while a winchman was lowered on a thin wire into the black, churning water. The winchmen were descending into a nightmare. They swung wildly in the wind, spinning on their cables, often dunked into the freezing waves before they could reach a target. When they finally grabbed a survivor, they had to wrestle them into a harness or a basket. The survivors were often too stiff to help. Their hands were frozen into claws. They were heavy with waterlogged clothes. Sometimes, the winchman would grab a person only to have them slip away, their strength gone, vanishing back into the dark. For the survivors, the sound of the helicopter was the sound of resurrection. The blinding downwash of the rotors, the spray whipping their faces, it was violent, but it was hope. They were hoisted up one by one, dangling in the void, pulled from the jaws of the Baltic, and deposited onto the warm metal floor of the helicopter cabin. But the arithmetic remained cruel. A helicopter can only carry so many people. When it is full, it must leave. It must fly to the nearest land or ship, unload, refuel, and return. The cycle takes time, and time was the one resource the people in the water did not have. For those left behind when the sound of the rotors faded, the despair was absolute. The cold deepened. The body's core temperature dropped below 30 degrees. The heart began to stutter. This is the moment where the mind disconnects from reality. Survivors later reported hallucinations. They saw ships that weren't there. They heard choirs singing. They felt a strange, comfortable warmth spreading through their chest. The paradoxical undressing phenomenon, the final lie of a dying brain. The dawn came slowly, a grey, reluctant light that revealed the vastness of the tragedy. The storm had begun to break, the waves subsiding into a sullen, rolling swell. The surface of the sea was littered with the detritus of the floating city. Deck chairs, life vests, suitcases, and bodies. Hundreds of bodies. The rescue operation shifted from a frantic race to a somber harvest. The helicopters continued to pluck the living from the rafts, but the intervals between rescues grew longer. The winches were pulling up more and more bodies, until the crews were told to prioritize only those who showed signs of life. It was a battlefield triage applied to the ocean. By late morning, the final count began to emerge, and it was devastating. Of the 989 people on board, only 137 were alive. Most of the survivors were young, strong men. The elderly, the children, the women, they were almost entirely gone. The demographics of survival were dictated by brute physical strength. If you could not climb the listing floor, if you could not hold on to the raft, if you could not withstand the cold for 4 hours, you died. The survivors were flown to hospitals in Turku, Stockholm, and Mariehamn. They arrived in states of profound shock. They were wrapped in foil blankets, their skin blue, their eyes wide and staring. They were the returned. They had seen the other side. They had been inside the beast when it swallowed the world. In the terminals and shipping offices, a different kind of horror was unfolding. The fax machines were spitting out lists of names. In 1994, information did not travel at the speed of the internet. It traveled by phone and paper. Families gathered at the harbors in Tallinn and Stockholm, waiting. They waited for a name to appear on the saved list. They scanned the sheets of paper pinned to corkboards. For most, the name never appeared. The confusion was compounded by errors. In the chaos of the rescue, names were misspelled, or people were misidentified. Some families were told their loved ones were safe, only to have that hope snatched away hours later. Others were told their relatives were missing, only to find them in a hospital bed the next day. But eventually, the lists settled. The numbers hardened into facts. Estonia had lost a generation of its brightest. Sweden had lost hundreds of its citizens. Entire families had been wiped out. There were villages in Sweden where 50 people had gone on the trip, and none returned. The silence of the radio had been replaced by the silence of the empty houses. As the shock began to recede, it was replaced by a hunger for answers. The grief was too large to remain passive. It needed a target. How? How does a modern 20,000-ton ferry, fully certified and crewed, sink in less than an hour? Ships are not supposed to sink, not like this, not so fast. The Baltic Sea, usually a highway of commerce, was now a crime scene. The authorities declared the site of the sinking a graveyard, but it was also evidence. The Joint Accident Investigation Commission, the JAIC, was formed immediately, composed of members from Estonia, Finland, and Sweden. Their task was monumental: to reconstruct a disaster that lay 80 meters underwater in international waters, involving a ship built in Germany, owned by Estonians, and carrying Swedes. The politics of the investigation were present from the very first day. National pride, corporate liability, and insurance billions were all at stake. The shipyard that built the Estonia, Meyer Werft, had a reputation to protect. The Estonian government, newly independent, saw the ship as a symbol of their nation. For it to be blamed on crew incompetence would be a national humiliation. The Swedish maritime authorities, who had inspected the ship, had to answer for why she was allowed to sail. But before the arguments could fully ignite, they needed to find the ship. They needed to see the corpse. Sonar vessels swept the area. The images that came back were ghostly. The Estonia lay on her starboard side, on a slope of clay and mud. She was intact. She looked like she was sleeping. But there was something wrong with the bow. The remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, were sent down. These robotic eyes, tethered to the surface by long cables, descended into the gloom. Their lights cut through the silt and darkness. They moved along the white hull, past the name Estonia, painted in black letters, past the dark voids of the bridge windows where the captain had stood. When the ROVs reached the bow, the operators saw the smoking gun. The visor was gone. The face of the ship was missing. The loading ramp was slightly open, hanging ajar like a broken jaw. This discovery changed everything. It shifted the focus from a mysterious hole or a bomb to a mechanical failure. The search radius was expanded. If the visor had fallen off, it must be somewhere nearby. A few weeks later, they found it. The Atlantic lock, the bottom lock of the visor, was the key. They found the visor lying on the seabed, more than a mile west of the wreck. This distance was crucial. It told the story of the timeline. The visor had detached while the ship was still moving forward. The ship had sailed on, leaving its nose behind, driving its open mouth into the waves for several minutes before the engines stopped. The recovery of the visor was a solemn operation. A giant crane barge lifted the 55-ton steel shell from the bottom. As it broke the surface, water cascading from its rusty flanks, it looked like the skull of a prehistoric beast. It was battered, dented, and scarred. It was placed on the deck of a barge, a twisted piece of metal that had killed 852 people. The investigators swarmed over it. They looked at the hinges, they looked at the locks. They found metal that had been torn apart. They found welds that looked weak. They found the evidence of a battle between steel and water, a battle the steel had lost. But the clarity of the physical evidence did not lead to clarity in the public mind. Instead, it opened the door to a bitter, decades-long war of narratives. The official story began to coalesce. The locking devices were underdimensioned. The design was flawed. The wave loads were higher than calculated. The crew, unable to see the bow, didn't know the visor had fallen off until it was too late. It was a tragic accident, a convergence of bad design and bad weather. But this explanation felt too small for the magnitude of the loss. It felt too clean. Families of the victims looked at the timeline and asked questions. Why did the ship sink so fast? Even with the car deck flooded, Shouldn't there have been air pockets below? Why didn't the ship capsize completely and float upside down, like other ferries in similar accidents? Why did she go to the bottom so quickly? Rumors began to circulate. Darker theories took root in the grief-stricken soil of the survivor communities. Was there a hole in the hull? Was the ship carrying something it shouldn't have been? Military equipment, smuggled metal? Was there an explosion? The German shipyard, facing massive liability, launched its own investigation. They hired experts to prove that the maintenance was poor, that the crew was incompetent, that the ship had been driven too hard. They pointed fingers at the Estonian crew, suggesting they had reacted too slowly, that they had turned the ship the wrong way. The blame game had begun, and it was ugly. It was a second trauma inflicted on the survivors. They had fought the sea, and now they had to fight the bureaucracy. They wanted to know why their loved ones were dead. Instead, they got technical reports about yield strength and moment arms. Meanwhile, the wreck lay on the bottom, a sanctuary violated by cameras but sealed by law. The governments made a controversial decision. They would not recover the bodies. The cost was deemed too high, the trauma to the divers too great, the logistics too complex. They declared the wreck a grave. They talked about covering it with concrete, sealing it forever like a radioactive core. To the families, this felt like a betrayal. It felt like a cover-up. You don't pour concrete over a crime scene unless you want to hide something. The refusal to bring the bodies home festered. It created a permanent wound. The sea had taken the dead, and the state was refusing to give them back. The act of the crisis was ending, but the act of the legacy was just beginning. The sinking of the Estonia had shattered the illusion of safety in the Baltic. It had exposed the fragility of the ro-ro design. It had humiliated the maritime engineering community. But most of all, it had left a void, a silence. If you stand on the shores of the Baltic today, looking out at the grey water, you are looking at a cemetery. The ships still cross. The music still plays in the bars. The duty-free shops still sell their perfume and chocolate. But beneath the keel of every ferry that sails from Tallinn to Stockholm, there is a ghost. The Estonia is down there. She is rusting. She is disintegrating. But she is not silent. Through the decades, she has continued to speak, whispering new secrets, challenging the official version of history, refusing to let the world forget the night the sea won. We have counted the dead. We have found the visor. We have written the reports. But we have not found peace. The water is too cold, and the memory is too deep. The crisis was an explosion of violence. The aftermath was a slow, grinding erosion of trust. And as the years passed, the rust on the visor would become a mirror for the rust in the institutions that were supposed to protect us. The story was supposed to end with the report. But disaster narratives rarely obey the rules of closure. The Estonia was not just a ship that sank. She was a question that refused to be answered. And as the 20th century turned into the 21st, that question would rise to the surface again, brought up by new technology, new evidence, and the unyielding persistence of those who were left behind. The wreck was about to become a battlefield once more. The dead do not speak, but the laws written in their names do. In the years following 1994, the maritime world engaged in a quiet, desperate act of penance. It was a penance of regulation. The sinking of the Estonia had revealed a terrifying truth, that the rules governing safety at sea were reactive, written in the blood of previous disasters. The Titanic gave us the rules for lifeboats. The Estonia gave us the rules for stability. Before that September night, a ferry was considered safe, even if its car deck was a vulnerability. After the Estonia, the International Maritime Organization rewrote the Bible of safety, known as SOLAS, the safety of life at sea. They introduced new requirements that were draconian in their specificity. They demanded that ro-ro ferries be able to survive with water on the car deck. They demanded better locks, better sensors and surveillance cameras that would show the bridge crew the bow at all times. They effectively legislated that the machine must never again be allowed to hide its wounds from its masters. Today, if you drive your car onto a ferry in the Baltic, you are driving onto a vessel that has been ghost-written by the Estonia. The heavy steel floodgates that now divide car decks, preventing the free surface effect from destabilizing the ship. Those are the legacy of the drowned. The indicator lights that scream alarm if a visor moves a fraction of an inch. Those are the echoes of the silence on the Estonia's bridge. We paid for these safety features with 852 lives. It was an expensive tuition. But while the engineers were fixing the future, the politicians were struggling to manage the past. The wreck of the Estonia lay in shallow water, reachable by anyone with a decent boat and diving gear. It was a vulnerability. It was a site of horror, but also a site of potential plunder. And, for the paranoid, a site of evidence that contradicted the official story. In 1995, a decision was made that remains one of the most controversial in maritime history. The governments of Sweden, Finland, and Estonia decided not to recover the bodies. Instead, they declared the site a sanctuary. They signed a treaty, the Estonia Agreement, which made it a criminal offense for their citizens to dive on the wreck. They attempted to legislate the seabed into a sacred, untouchable zone, but a law on paper was not enough. They wanted to seal it physically. They proposed a plan to encase the entire ship, a vessel 500 feet long, in a sarcophagus of concrete and sand. They wanted to turn the wreck into a man-made geological feature. Barges were sent out. They began to dump thousands of tons of gravel and rocks onto the site. The stones rained down through the dark water, clattering against the white hull, burying the bridge, burying the windows where passengers had looked out. It was a biblical attempt to erase the event, but the outcry was deafening. The families of the victims saw it not as a respectful burial, but as a grotesque industrial cover-up. They argued that you do not pour concrete over a crime scene. They argued that their loved ones were being treated like nuclear waste. Under public pressure, the dumping stopped. The concrete shell was never finished. The Estonia was left half-buried, draped in a shroud of gravel, protected by a legal force field that threatened prison time for anyone who dared to visit. For 25 years, the silence held. The official report was published in 1997, blaming the visor locks and heavy weather. The case was considered closed. The sea had claimed its due, the laws had been changed, and the story was expected to fade into the history books, joining the Titanic and the Lusitania as a tragedy of a bygone era. But the ocean has a way of preserving things. Iron corrodes, but questions do not. In the psyche of the Baltic nations, the Estonia never really sank. It hovered just beneath the surface of the national conversation. The survivors, now aging, carried the trauma in their bodies. They spoke of the Estonia syndrome, a permanent vigilance, a fear of enclosed spaces, a distrust of the ground beneath their feet. They lived with the survivors' guilt, the unanswerable question, why me? Why did I have the strength to climb the wall when the person next to me did not? And the families of the dead lived with the void. Without bodies to bury, without a grave to visit, the grieving process was arrested. It was frozen in 1994. They demanded new dives. They demanded to know why the ship sank so fast. They pointed to the inconsistencies. How could a visor failure alone cause such a rapid capsizing? Why did survivors report a loud bang before the list? The official guardians of the narrative dismissed these questions as conspiracy theories. They held up the 1997 report like a shield. Then came the year 2020. A documentary team, defying the treaty and facing prosecution, sent a remote-operated vehicle down to the wreck. Technology had advanced light years since the 90s. The cameras were sharper, the lights were brighter. They scanned the hull, moving along the starboard side, the side that had been resting against the seabed, largely hidden from previous surveys. What they saw sent a shockwave through the world. There, in the steel plating of the hull, was a hole. It was not a small crack. It was a massive, vertical tear, 4 meters high and over a meter wide. The steel was bent inward, as if struck by a colossal external force. The footage was broadcast to a stunned public. The official narrative, which had stood rigid for a quarter of a century, suddenly looked fragile. The experts had said the hull was intact. They had said the only water entry was through the car deck. But here was a gaping wound in the side of the ship, leading directly into the cabins below the waterline. The piece of the grave was shattered. The treaty had failed to keep the truth, or at least a new version of it, from surfacing. The discovery of the hole forced the governments to reopen the investigation. The final verdict of 1997 was no longer final. New dives were authorized. Photogrammetry scans created a 3D digital twin of the wreck, accurate to the millimeter. The Estonia was brought back to the surface, not in steel, but in data. The debate reignited with ferocious intensity. Was the hole caused by a collision with a submarine? Was it caused by an explosion? Or was it, as the new official analysis suggested, caused by the ship hitting a rock outcrop on the seabed as it sank? The rock theory is the current scientific consensus. It posits that the ship, rolling and sliding on the bottom, smashed against a granite ridge, tearing the hull open. If true, it means the hole happened after the sinking, not as the cause of it. It means the visor was still the culprit. But for many, the trust is gone. The hole is a symbol of everything that was missed, everything that was hidden, everything that was rushed. It represents the failure of the initial investigation to look at the whole picture. It represents the arrogance of saying, "We know," when the evidence is 80 meters down in the dark. This is the legacy of the Estonia. It is not just a legacy of improved safety regulations. It is a legacy of doubt. It taught us that official reports are political documents as much as technical ones. It taught us that even the most solid-looking institutions can have cracks in their hull. As we stand here today, looking back at the event, we must recognize that the story has no clean ending. There is no moment where the music swells and the screen fades to black with a satisfying answer. The Estonia is a jagged scar on the timeline of maritime history. But perhaps that is the point. The Estonia serves as a permanent, underwater monument to human fallibility. It reminds us that our mastery over nature is an illusion. We build steel leviathans. We equip them with radar and GPS and stabilizers. We fill them with restaurants and tax-free shops. We create a bubble of comfort and pretend that the Atlantic Ocean is just a highway. But the sea is not a highway. It is a wilderness. It is a chaotic, energetic system that has no regard for our schedules or our engineering. The night the Estonia sank, the Baltic Sea was simply doing what it has done for millions of years, seeking equilibrium. The ship was an anomaly, an unstable object, and the sea corrected it. For the engineers of the future, the Estonia is a textbook written in shadow. It teaches humility. It teaches that you cannot design for the likely scenario. You must design for the impossible one. You must design for the moment when the lock breaks, when the crew is confused, when the power fails, and when the waves are higher than the statistical average. And for the rest of us, the passengers, the story is a reminder of the fragility of the routine. We walk through our lives assuming that the floor will stay horizontal, that the lights will stay on, that the journey will end at the destination. We trust the machine. The passengers of the Estonia trusted the machine. They were just like us. They were traveling for work, for love, for commerce. They were asleep in their cabins, dreaming of Stockholm, dreaming of the morning. They did not know that they were actors in a tragedy that had been written years before, on a drafting table, in a budget meeting, in a maintenance log. Today, the site of the wreck is quiet. The buoys mark the grave, the currents drift past the rusted hull, slowly burying it in the soft clay of the seabed. The concrete that was dumped there in the 90s is now just part of the tomb. The hole in the side gapes into the darkness, a mouth that can no longer speak. The survivors are old now. Some have passed away, joining their shipmates in the history of the event. But those who remain carry a specific wisdom. They know how quickly the world can turn on its side. They know the sound of the end, and they know the value of a single breath. The Estonia will eventually disappear. The steel will dissolve. The hull will collapse. The Baltic will reclaim the materials, turning the white ship back into iron oxide and silt. But the memory must remain. It must remain as a warning against the hubris of speed, a warning against the complacency of routine, a warning that the sea is always watching, always testing, and always waiting for us to make a mistake. The listing is over. The ship is at rest, but the water above it is moving, grey and restless, under the same cold sky. The journey continues, but the lesson remains. Respect the sea. For it gives everything, and it can take everything away. This is the story of the MS Estonia, a story of grand ambition, of terrible failure, and of the enduring silence that follows the storm.